Dr. Perros is time constrained. He's got another meeting he's got to go to. I wonder if we even lost him. No, he's still there. Can we just ask for questions for Dr. Perros first, and then Dr. Barr, who's also got commitments, and then happily Dr. Corti has got more flexibility. So any questions for Dr. Perros? You know, your points were very compelling, Dr. Perros, about the market demand. And how do you see the circumstances now for the zoliflodicin product? Do you see it coming to market? You've commented about how it's delayed because of the lack of a substantial economic driver. Where do you see it coming to human use timeline-wise from your perspective?
With the partnership that we have with GARP, I'm very optimistic now. The phase 3 is underway, and we're expecting data in most likely the early part of 2021. This is an oral drug and one that works against drug-resistant infections. We hope that the guidelines will be revised when the product becomes available, and we position this product for clinical use in a way that makes sense. We have done our best to minimize our costs, as you reckon from my presentation. We've been developing the late-stage development of this product has been through partnerships for the most part, but there does need to be a return. Even if we got the product for free, keeping the drug on the market is a costly endeavor, and there needs to be a pricing distribution structure that would make it possible for that to happen. So that's what we need to take care of in the next couple of years. My apologies, I do have to run, but I would be happy to answer any other questions the committee might have by email later in the day.
We'll do that. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Now we're left with Dr. Barr and Dr. Corti, and we open it up for questions. I know Sean Young has an immediate question, if you can remember it from about 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, I was just curious, and it was about from the marketing group in the framing around stigma, and if in how the discussions were made around HPV versus cancer vaccination.
Sure. So I think we were mindful that people had various ideas about who was responsible for getting an STD, and whether there was this was quote unquote a voluntary or involuntary infection, and we heard a lot about that from stakeholders. At the end of the day, for us, it was what we sought to remind everyone is that 50% of Americans would get HPV infection at one point or another. That HPV infection was common among people even who had only a single lifetime sex partner, and but whose partner may have been had other sex partners. And so, those kind of issues came around, were addressed, but more than anything, we tried to remove the notion of sex from the vaccine, simply because people don't deserve to die from cancer. And if there's something to prevent cancer, then here you are, you can get a vaccination. And that was more resonant, I think, because the acquisition of HPV tended to occur among young adults, some of whom were below age 18, and so that created all sorts of troubles otherwise dealing with notions of stigma. In terms of men, we went ahead and did the studies looking at anal cancer in MSM, and that was an important program for us, but we would tend to frankly state that men get cancer and not go into the details of that.
So I have two questions. First, I'm just curious whether the HPV vaccine was a commercial success from your point of view. And the other is a broader question that when we think about just more generally vaccines for STIs, do you think are the barriers primarily scientific, or are the barriers economic, or both? Can you kind of comment on what you think are the challenges?
So, so the HPV vaccine was a commercial success for the company, but it required an enormous upfront investment because of the size and scope of the program and the infrastructure required to manufacture the vaccine. It took many years for the vaccine to actually reach an inflection point when demand really started to increase. And that was really valuable for, that was really rewarding, but at the same time, we had gotten a little complacent, and that was, and now we are, the vaccine we're stretching supplies as much as possible and building factories. In terms of broader considerations about STIs, STI vaccines, it's easier to speak about specific STIs. So, if you're thinking about chlamydia, for us, a chlamydia vaccine is really important. It would be really valuable from a commercial point of view because chlamydia is a disease that infects both men and women and causes significant morbidity above and beyond the urethritis and other acute effects. And I think that helps destigmatize issues around gonorrhea and syphilis, which are equally problematic, but or quite problematic, I should say, but by their nature create a lot of issues from the sociocultural point of view. So the most important thing for me, because STI vaccines has a stigma attached, has a higher barrier attached to it, is to focus on those STIs that have substantial long-term consequence, even among those individuals who are not considered high risk, and be willing to invest in harder endpoints to drive home the point that people have real consequences from these infections and diseases, and to take away people's judgment of individuals from the equation. And again, so that's why for chlamydia vaccine, I would focus my attention on PID or on infertility, and be willing to bite a huge amount to have to spend a big amount of money on a reasonable candidate, because the end result would be a really substantial benefit for women and men.
Let me ask a question from Ned Hook, who had to run to a DSMB call. How important was informing patients versus providers to build demand for an HPV vaccine?
I think it's both. People didn't know very much about HPV, but they knew a lot about why. Moms knew a lot about Pap testing. The question that we always grappled with was, should we do we have to tell people that HPV is sexually transmitted? We don't talk about the mode of transmission when we vaccinate against other childhood infections, but that was a mixed sort of response. We had, some people wanted it, some people felt it was necessary to inform that way. But I think we needed to have. I think providers were. The barriers with providers was that they were uncomfortable with the notion of talking about HPV as a sexually transmitted infection when in front of you is a child who's between 9 and 12 years old and mom's in the room. And so, we had to get past that with the right kind of messages and the right kind of understanding for both for moms to be comfortable with that. And so I think both were issues, and both required individual attention. At the end of the day, with regard to HPV vaccine, mom's the decision maker in majority of cases in the United States. And so, they're very important constituents here.
So this is, I'm not really sure how to formulate this question, but so it's very, very expensive to develop medication, point-of-care tests. I know that most of its R&D is driving a lot of the costs, but there's other countries that are producing medicines that are much cheaper. And I don't know if they've done they've taken the R&D from us and developed generics, but what is it that's the biggest barrier? What's making it so expensive? Why is it so hard for us to?
Well, because of one of the things you pointed out was a big issue here. Most of the time, when manufacturers can manufacture, and say, well, we'll give you a generic price, is because the technology and all the clinical trials and all of the regulatory requirements, including long-term follow-up and safety and so on and so forth, were done by the originator manufacturer. The other part that's really expensive is the factory. In some parts of the world, one can build a factory and make very good vaccines, for example, but they would not fit the regulatory standard of an FDA or an EMA for a variety of reasons, and those do induce quite a bit of cost. A factory is extremely expensive. We recently announced that we were building manufacturing facilities primarily for Gardasil, and it would cost $1.2 billion just for new factories. And so, there's a lot of cost associated with this. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day you can't find a manufacturer after many years where the primary producer a primary manufacturer has made all the investment and ultimately create something that can work in emerging markets. It's just that someone has to have taken both the financial and intellectual risk of going forward with that, with the idea of a return and hence the costs.
I'm wondering how big of a concern is liability, and I'm just wondering how important legal reforms are as a means to lower the cost.
Yeah, I think VSIP is so I think that vaccine the vaccine injury adjudication program is very, very, very important in the United States because we spend enormous amount of time working on demonstrating the safety profile of our vaccine, and the regulatory authorities and public health authorities spend a great deal of time and attention on this. I do think that litigation's always been an issue in vaccines because vaccines are given to the entire population, and people have coincident, true and unrelated events that happen. And I think it's important to make sure that in this age where there is a lot more vaccine hesitancy, that companies don't feel like they're going to expose themselves in an undue way to spurious lawsuits based on these issues. At the same time, as a company, we've been very clear about our responsibility to demonstrate the long-term safety of our vaccines and drugs, and that has served us well in situations where people have asked questions about this, and that's been true especially for Gardasil.
Before we go to Neeraj, I wonder if, Brenda, you could also respond to that liability question, because if a point-of-care diagnostic misses a disease or overtreats, has that been a major concern of your organization?
No, it's not. It's something I've really considered that much. I see the big challenge, and I think just in terms of even the level of questions. I mean, point of care testing has the researchers view it, the developers view it as providing great potential value. yet it's very difficult in getting it into use because the adopters are considering cost issues relative to volume-based laboratory testing. They have to totally change their systems to bring it in. So this concept of value proposition is, I think, first and foremost what needs to occur to help bridge that gap and get developers more informed earlier in the process to then sort of ease into the provider usage. But also providers need to have decision processes in place. I mean, right now it's, they often just use vendor information to make their decisions. They don't have any kind of a structured process to really consider value beyond cost. And so perceptions come into play where negative perceptions actually come into play in terms of the potential of point of care devices. But given a more structured way of evaluating the devices that capture value across all of these different outcome settings, bringing in patient perspectives, that has, I think, is what is needed to help deal with this problem. Because a lot of investment is going into point of care devices, but not a lot's coming out of it use-wise.
Josh?
So I have a question about the health economic modeling for Gardasil. And you said like one of the things is that the mothers are kind of making the decisions, and one of the benefits to moms would be just less anxiety that, given that their children are protected with a HPV vaccine and would not get HPV in the future. So was that like the effects of the vaccine on because of less anxiety or worry about getting a HPV in the future? Was that part of the quality of life effects or not, or did it just focus?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. That was a difficult to quantify endpoint. Actually, most of the cost effectiveness modeling that occurred really was about the infection in the individual, her or himself, and the impact of the infection on direct effects. The modeling, there's NITAGs such as the ACIP and CDC have a specific format to the cost effectiveness analyses that they do, and we try to work within that framework. I think that that in general we do include quality of life measures, of course, but they tend to focus on direct effects, that is to say, the effect on the individual, as opposed to indirect effects, which would be more like about family and productivity, et cetera. Although those are legitimate issues, undoubtedly.
Well, this has been a vibrant session. I want to thank Dr. Barr and Dr. Corti for this, and we're actually going to continue the themes of point-of-care testing as well as drug development, vaccine development with Dr. Deal. And we will have to cut our lunch break a bit short, and probably our discussion with Dr. Deal a bit short, but let's dive in. Carolyn, thank you.